A night of light rain over the wake, windows rattling, lights low. A millionaire in a dark suit gets out of the car and crosses the hall to a corner without witnesses. At 20 years old, the young woman stays close to the coffin, hands clasped, eyes on the doors. He leans against the side table, adjusts the vigil torch and slides a piece of metal under the tablecloth. A German shepherd enters silently, sniffs the floor, and fixes its snout on the hidden object. The man moves away slowly, phone in his pocket, his footsteps vanishing down the corridor. The young woman bends down, pulls the metal, the piece turns into a key, and a box opens a fraction. Footsteps approach, and the next sound no one there was ready to hear. Love stories with animals. Then subscribe now and don't miss a single one. Thank you for following us. Now, back to our story. The funeral parlor in Millbrook, North Carolina, was draped in an uneasy silence, broken only by the gentle patter of rain against the old stained glass windows and the occasional creak of wooden chairs. The mourners sat motionless, as if even the smallest gesture might seem inappropriate in the solemnity of the moment. Samuel Henderson had been a pillar of their small community, a man whose sudden passing had left everyone questioning what secrets might have gone with him to the grave. Emily Patterson, 20 years old with eyes that held both innocence and quiet determination, sat in the third row, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had always been close to her Uncle Samuel, closer than anyone else in the family seemed to understand. While others saw him as the eccentric old man who lived alone in the sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, Emily had seen something deeper, something that had drawn her to spend countless afternoons listening to his stories about travels to distant places and business ventures that seemed almost too extraordinary to be true. The Reverend's voice droned on in measured tones, speaking of Samuel's contributions to the community and his generous spirit. Emily found her attention drifting, not out of disrespect, but because she felt something was missing from this carefully orchestrated farewell. Uncle Samuel had been unpredictable in life, full of surprises and unexpected gestures. This formal service felt too conventional for a man who had never been conventional himself. That's when it happened. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open with a soft whoosh, and every head turned in unison. What they saw made several people gasp audibly. A magnificent German shepherd, his coat gleaming despite the rain, walked down the center aisle with purpose and dignity. Between his teeth, he carried something that caught the dim light filtering. Through the windows, a metallic object that seemed to pulse with its own inner radiance. The Reverend stopped mid-sentence, his prepared words dissolving into stunned silence. Mrs. Henderson, Samuel's elderly sister, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth in shock. The dog, seemingly oblivious to the stir he was causing, continued his measured pace down the aisle until he reached the front of the chapel. There, with careful precision, he placed the object on the floor near the casket and sat back on his haunches, as if he had completed an important task. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She recognized the dog. This was Max, Uncle Samuel's loyal companion, who had disappeared 3 days ago, shortly after Samuel's passing. The family had assumed the grief-stricken animal had simply run away, unable to cope with the loss of his master. But here he was, and he had brought something with him. Something that seemed to shimmer with significance in the hushed atmosphere of the funeral parlor. From the corner of her eye, Emily noticed another figure whose reaction seemed different from the general shock and confusion around them. James Whitmore, 30 years old, and one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties, sat near the back of the chapel. His expression remained carefully controlled, almost as if he had been expecting something like this to happen. While others whispered and pointed, James simply watched with calculating eyes, his jaw set in a hard line that suggested he knew more about this situation than he was letting on. Emily had always been curious about James's presence at the funeral. Uncle Samuel had never mentioned knowing any wealthy businessmen, and James seemed like he belonged in a different world entirely. His expensive suit and confident bearing stood out among the small-town mourners, and Emily had noticed how he had arrived alone, speaking to no one, positioning himself where he could observe everything while remaining somewhat apart from the proceedings. The metallic object that Max had delivered gleamed in the subdued lighting, and Emily could see now that it appeared to be some kind of ornate key, or perhaps a small decorative piece. It was clearly old, with intricate engravings that caught the light whenever someone shifted in their seat, causing shadows to dance across its surface. The craftsmanship looked European, possibly antique, and definitely not something that belonged in their small North Carolina town. A voice from behind Emily broke through her contemplation. "Well, I never," muttered Richard Caldwell, a distant cousin of Samuel's, whom Emily had met only a handful of times over the years. Richard had always struck her as bitter about something, though she had never been quite sure what. "That dog always was too attached to the old man. Probably stolen that trinket from the house before anyone could stop him." The comment was clearly intended to be heard, and Emily felt several pairs of eyes turned toward her. She wasn't sure why, but Richard's tone suggested he was implying something more than simple theft. There was an accusation hidden in his words, though Emily couldn't fathom what he might be suggesting. "Emily always had a special way with that dog," Richard continued, his voice carrying just enough to reach the ears around him. "Spent more time at Samuel's place than anywhere else. Makes you wonder what else might have gone missing before we could take proper inventory." Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from indignation. The suggestion that she might have taken something from Uncle Samuel's house was not only false, but deeply hurtful. She had loved her uncle dearly, and the idea that anyone would think she would steal from him made her stomach turn. But she also recognized the dangerous territory that Richard was mapping out with his insinuations. In a small town like Millbrook, reputation meant everything, and rumors had a way of taking on a life of their own. James Whitmore's eyes had moved from the dog to Emily, and she found herself under his scrutiny. Unlike the suspicious glances of some of the other mourners, his gaze seemed more analytical than accusatory. It was as if he was trying to solve a puzzle and was carefully examining each piece before deciding where it might fit. The Reverend, finally recovering from his shock, cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the service. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "this is simply Samuel's faithful companion, saying his own goodbye. Animals often have ways of expressing grief that we don't fully understand." But Emily knew it was more than that. Uncle Samuel had always been deliberate in everything he did, and she had inherited enough of his observational skills to recognize patterns that others might miss. Max's arrival wasn't random, and neither was the timing. The dog had waited until the formal part of the service was nearly complete, almost as if he had been listening from outside and knew exactly when to make his entrance. As the service concluded, and people began to file out slowly, Emily remained in her seat, her attention fixed on the mysterious object that still lay near the casket. Max had positioned himself nearby, as if standing guard, and his intelligent eyes seemed to be watching Emily specifically. When she finally stood to leave, the dog rose as well, and she had the distinct impression that he was waiting for her to do something. The last few mourners filtered out into the rainy afternoon, their conversations a mix of sympathy for the family and speculation about the strange interruption. Emily found herself walking slower than usual, reluctant to leave Max alone with his mysterious delivery. As she reached the door, she turned back one more time and saw that James Whitmore had not left either. He stood near the front of the chapel, studying the object with the same careful attention she had noticed earlier. Their eyes met across the empty chairs, and for a moment, Emily felt as if they were the only two people who understood that something significant had just happened. something that went beyond a simple funeral service and touched on secrets that Uncle Samuel had apparently taken great care to preserve. The rain continued to drum against the windows, and Emily realized that this grey afternoon had marked not just the end of her uncle's life, but the beginning of something entirely unexpected in her own. As she stepped out into the drizzle, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Max's arrival had been the opening move in a game whose rules she didn't yet understand, but in which she was apparently destined to play a central role. 3 days after the funeral, Emily found herself standing outside Samuel's Victorian estate, the ornate key Max had delivered burning like a secret in her jacket pocket. The house looked different now, somehow smaller and more vulnerable without her uncle's presence filling its rooms. The wraparound porch that had once been her favorite place to listen to Samuel's stories now seemed to sag under the weight of abandonment. She had convinced the funeral director to let her examine the mysterious object more closely after the service, and what she had discovered had only deepened the puzzle. The metallic piece was indeed a key, but unlike any she had ever seen. Its intricate engravings depicted symbols that looked ancient, possibly Celtic or Norse in origin, and the metal itself had an unusual weight and coloration that suggested it was made of something more precious than ordinary brass or iron. Max had appeared at her apartment that morning, sitting patiently on her doorstep, as if he had been waiting for her to understand what needed to be done. The dog's presence had surprised her landlord, Mrs. Chen, but Emily had managed to convince the elderly woman that she was temporarily caring for her late uncle's pet until permanent arrangements could be made. In truth, she suspected that Max had made his own arrangements and had simply chosen her as his new companion. As Emily approached the front door of the estate, she noticed a sleek black sedan parked across the street. Through the tinted windows, she could make out the silhouette of someone watching the house. Her pulse quickened when she recognized the expensive vehicle as the same one James Whitmore had been driving at the funeral. Why would he be here, watching Samuel's house? What connection could a wealthy businessman possibly have to her eccentric uncle? The front door key felt heavy in her other pocket, the ordinary house key that Samuel had given her years ago when she had started visiting regularly. He had always encouraged her curiosity, praising her attention to detail and her ability to notice things that others overlooked. "You have the gift of observation, Emily," he used to say. "Never let anyone convince you that your instincts are wrong." Now those instincts were screaming that the ornate key in her possession was meant for something specific within these walls. As she unlocked the front door, Emily was surprised to hear footsteps on the gravel driveway behind her. She turned to see James Whitmore approaching, his expensive overcoat dark with moisture from the persistent drizzle that had settled over Millbrook since the funeral. His expression was unreadable, but his pace was deliberately casual, as if this meeting were purely coincidental. "Miss Patterson," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that seemed refined by years of education and business dealings. "I hope you don't mind my approaching you like this. I was hoping we might have a conversation about your uncle." Emily studied his face, noting the careful way he held himself and the practiced quality of his smile. Everything about James Whitmore suggested a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm and calculated pressure. She had encountered his type before in her business classes at the community college, ambitious men who treated every interaction as a potential transaction. "I'm not sure what there would be to discuss," Emily replied carefully. "I didn't know you and Uncle Samuel were acquainted." Something flickered across James's features, a momentary crack in his polished facade that suggested her observation had hit closer to home than he had expected. "Your uncle was a remarkable man with diverse interests. We had some business dealings that I think might interest you, particularly given your apparent inheritance of his more unusual possessions." The way he emphasized the word inheritance made Emily's hand instinctively move toward the pocket containing the ornate key. How could he possibly know about that? The object had been at the funeral for only a few minutes, and she had been careful not to let anyone see her examining it afterward. Unless James had been watching more carefully than she had realized, or unless he had known about the key before Max had delivered it. "What kind of business dealings?" Emily asked, not moving aside to let him pass but not closing the door either. Max had positioned himself beside her, and she could feel the tension in the dog's posture as he regarded James with what could only be described as suspicion. "The kind that required discretion and trust," James replied. "Samuel was helping me with some research into historical artifacts and their authentication. He had quite an expertise in European antiquities, particularly items with uncertain provenance. I think you'll find that knowledge becomes relevant very soon." Before Emily could respond, another car pulled up to the house, this one a battered pickup truck that she recognized as belonging to Richard Caldwell. Her heart sank as she watched her distant cousin climb out of the truck with the purposeful stride of someone who had come to make trouble. Richard had always been jealous of the relationship she had enjoyed with Uncle Samuel, and his behavior at the funeral had made it clear that he intended to use the unusual circumstances to his advantage. "Well, well," Richard called out as he approached the porch, "isn't this interesting? The mysterious businessman and the favorite niece having a private meeting at the scene of the crime." Crime? Emily felt anger rising in her chest. "What crime, Richard? Uncle Samuel passed away in his sleep. There was nothing criminal about it." Richard's smile was unpleasant as he climbed the porch steps, deliberately crowding the small space where Emily and James stood. "I'm talking about whatever's been taken from this house before the family has had a chance to do a proper inventory. Funny how certain people seem to have keys and know exactly where to look for valuable items." Emily realized that Richard's accusation was gaining traction in the small community. She had heard whispers at the grocery store and noticed the way some of her neighbors had been looking at her since the funeral. The combination of her close relationship with Samuel, the mysterious appearance of the ornate key, and Max's obvious attachment to her was creating a narrative that painted her as someone who had taken advantage of an elderly man's trust. James stepped forward slightly, and Emily was surprised when he spoke in her defense. "Mr. Caldwell, I think you're jumping to conclusions without any evidence. Samuel Henderson was a sharp man who made his own decisions about whom to trust. If he chose to share certain things with Miss Patterson, that was his prerogative." "And what would you know about it?" Richard snapped. "You show up at the funeral like you belonged there, acting like you knew Samuel, but nobody in this town has ever seen you before. For all we know, you're working together to strip this place clean before anyone can stop you." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Emily felt trapped between two forces she didn't fully understand. On one side was Richard, whose bitterness and suspicion were fueled by years of resentment and a desperate need to find someone to blame for his own disappointments. On the other side was James, whose motives remained unclear, but who seemed to know far more about her uncle than he was willing to admit. Max made the decision for her. The German Shepherd moved toward the front door and sat down, looking back at Emily with an expression that clearly communicated his desire to enter the house. The dog's behavior reminded her that she had come here for a purpose, and that purpose had nothing to do with Richard's accusations or James's mysterious business interests. "I'm going inside now," Emily announced, her voice steadier than she felt. "Uncle Samuel gave me a key to this house years ago, and I have every right to be here. If either of you has concerns about the estate, you can discuss them with the lawyer when the will is read." As she spoke, Emily caught James's reaction to Her mention of the will, his carefully controlled expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but she noticed the way his jaw tightened and how his eyes sharpened with interest. Whatever his connection to Samuel had been, the contents of the will were clearly important to him. Richard's face flushed with anger. That will might not be worth the paper it's written on, especially if certain people have been influencing a sick old man for their own benefit. I've already talked to a lawyer about contesting it, and trust me, the courts don't look kindly on people who take advantage of the elderly. Emily felt as if she had been slapped. The suggestion that she had manipulated her uncle was not only false but deeply painful. Samuel had been more of a father figure to her than her own distant parents, and the relationship they had shared had been built on genuine affection and mutual respect. The idea that someone could twist that bond into something calculating and predatory made her stomach turn with revulsion. "You don't know what you're talking about," Emily said quietly, but her voice carried a steel that surprised all three of them. Uncle Samuel was one of the sharpest people I've ever known, right up until the day he passed. If you think you can rewrite history to suit your own purposes, you're going to be disappointed. James had been watching this exchange with obvious interest, and Emily realized that he was learning as much from their argument as she was. His presence here wasn't coincidental, and his offer to defend her hadn't been motivated by chivalry. He was gathering information, trying to understand the dynamics of Samuel's family and determine how they might affect whatever plans he had been making with her uncle. As Emily opened the front door and stepped into the familiar entryway, she could hear Richard and James continuing their conversation behind her, their voices low but carrying an undercurrent of tension that suggested they viewed each other as obstacles to their respective goals. Max followed her inside, his claws clicking on the hardwood floors that Samuel had always kept meticulously polished. The house felt different without her uncle's presence, not just empty, but somehow expectant, as if it were waiting for something to happen. Emily pulled the ornate key from her pocket and studied it in the better light of the hallway. The engravings seemed even more intricate now, and she could make out what appeared to be letters or numbers worked into the decorative patterns. This was definitely meant to open something specific, something that Samuel had wanted her to find. Max had moved toward the back of the house, toward Samuel's study, and Emily followed him with growing certainty that the answers she needed were waiting somewhere in the rooms, where her uncle had spent his final years working on projects that had seemed mysterious even to her. Samuel's study had always been Emily's favorite room in the house, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, antique desk, and the peculiar collection of artifacts that her uncle had gathered from his travels around the world. Now, as she stood in the doorway with Max beside her, the room felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The afternoon light filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the Persian rug and highlighting dust motes that danced in the air like tiny secrets. Max moved with purpose toward the massive oak desk that dominated one corner of the room. The dog sniffed around the base of the desk, then sat down and looked back at Emily with an expression that clearly indicated she should investigate something specific. Emily approached carefully, running her hands along the carved edges of the desk, searching for anything that might correspond to the unusual key she carried. The desk was a magnificent piece, clearly European in origin, with intricate woodwork that matched the Celtic-style symbols she had noticed on the key. As her fingers traced the carved patterns, she discovered that some of the decorative elements were actually movable. A small wooden panel near the bottom right corner of the desk shifted slightly when she pressed it, revealing a tiny keyhole that had been perfectly camouflaged within the design. Emily's heart raced as she pulled out the ornate key. The size looked right, and when she slid it into the hidden lock, it turned with a satisfying click that seemed to echo through the quiet room. Immediately, she heard a soft mechanical sound, like gears turning within the desk itself. A section of the desktop that she had never noticed before began to rise slowly, revealing a hidden compartment that contained several items wrapped in what appeared to be oiled cloth. With trembling hands, Emily unwrapped the first package and found herself looking at a collection of old letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was elegant but foreign, and the postmarks were from various European cities dating back over 20 years. The return addresses were partially obscured, but she could make out fragments that included names like Whitmore and Associates and International Antiquities Research. The second package contained what appeared to be photographs of various artifacts, some of which looked similar to pieces she had seen in her uncle's collection. But these photos were clearly documentation rather than casual snapshots, with careful lighting and multiple angles that suggested professional authentication work. At the bottom of each photo was a small typed label with information about provenance, estimated age, and something called verification status. The final package made Emily gasp audibly. Inside was a letter addressed to her specifically, written in her uncle's distinctive handwriting. The date showed it had been composed just 2 weeks before his passing, as if he had somehow known that his time was running short and had wanted to ensure she would find this information. "My dear Emily," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then Max has successfully delivered the key, and you have proven yourself worthy of the trust I have always placed in your intelligence and integrity. What you have discovered today is only the beginning of a story that has been unfolding for decades, a story in which you now play a crucial part." Emily sank into the leather chair behind the desk, Max positioning himself protectively beside her as she continued reading. Her uncle's words painted a picture of a life far more complex than she had ever imagined. Samuel had not simply been a collector of interesting artifacts, he had been involved in a sophisticated network of researchers and authenticators who worked to verify the legitimacy of historical objects and ensure they were returned to their rightful owners or proper institutions. "The man you will have met by now, James Whitmore," the letter continued, "is not what he appears to be. He has been pressuring me for months to authenticate certain pieces in his collection, pieces that I believe were obtained through questionable means. I have been stalling him while conducting my own investigation, but I fear my time is running out. You must be very careful around him, Emily. His charm masks a determination that could be dangerous to anyone who stands in his way." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered James's behavior at the funeral and his appearance at the house today. His knowledge of the key and his mention of business dealings with Samuel suddenly took on a more sinister quality. She had instinctively distrusted him, but now she understood that her uncle had shared those concerns. The letter went on to explain that several valuable pieces in Samuel's collection were actually being held in trust until their proper ownership could be established. "I've spent years building relationships with museums and cultural institutions around the world," Samuel had written. "Some of the items in this house represent not just monetary value, but irreplaceable pieces of human heritage that belong to specific communities and nations." A sound from the front of the house interrupted Emily's reading, voices that seemed to be getting closer to the study. She quickly gathered the letters and photographs, tucking them into her jacket while leaving the hidden compartment open. If someone was coming to search the house, she didn't want them to know what she had discovered. James Whitmore appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes immediately moving to the desk where Emily sat. "I hope you don't mind me coming in," he said smoothly. "Mr. Caldwell left, but I thought you might appreciate some assistance going through your uncle's things. Old houses like this can hold surprises." "What kind of surprises?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady while her mind raced with the implications of what she had just learned. The photographs and letters in her jacket felt like they were radiating heat, and she was acutely aware that James was studying her face for any sign that she had discovered something significant. "Oh, you know how collectors can be," James replied, moving casually around the room, but clearly conducting his own search. "They often hide valuable items in unexpected places. Your uncle was particularly fond of puzzles and hidden compartments. I helped him design several concealment systems over the years." Emily felt her blood run cold. If James had helped Samuel create hiding places in this house, then he would know exactly where to look for anything valuable. Her uncle's warning about James's true nature was beginning to make perfect sense. This wasn't a casual visit from a concerned business associate. This was a systematic search by someone who knew the house's secrets. Max sensed the shift in Emily's emotional state and rose to his feet, positioning himself between her and James with a low growl that seemed to come from deep in his chest. The dog's reaction was immediate and unmistakable, and Emily realized that Max had probably witnessed interactions between Samuel and James that had made the animal wary of this particular visitor. "Your dog seems nervous," James observed, his tone remaining conversational, but his posture becoming more alert. "Animals can be so unpredictable when they're grieving. Perhaps it would be better if I helped you secure any valuable items before something unfortunate happens." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Emily understood that she was no longer safe in her uncle's house with this man. Samuel's letter had warned her about James's determination, but she was beginning to realize that the situation was even more dangerous than her uncle had anticipated. James wasn't just pressuring for authentication of questionable artifacts. He was actively searching for specific items that he believed Samuel had hidden. "I think I should probably lock up and leave," Emily said, standing slowly and trying not to show how frightened she was becoming. "I can come back another time when I'm feeling less emotional about being here." "Of course," James agreed, but he made no move toward the door. Instead, he continued his casual examination of the room, his gaze lingering on the bookshelves and the various cabinets that lined the walls. "Though I should mention that time might be a factor here. There are certain legal complications that could arise if valuable items aren't properly documented and secured quickly." Emily didn't believe for a moment that James was concerned about legal complications, at least not the kind that would affect her, but his mention of time pressure suggested that whatever he was looking for had some kind of deadline attached to it. Perhaps there were other people involved in this situation, people who were expecting James to deliver specific results within a certain time frame. As she moved toward the door, Emily noticed that James had positioned himself so that he could observe both her departure and continue his search of the room. The hidden compartment in the desk was still open, but from his angle, he probably couldn't see inside it. She needed to get out of the house, and somewhere safe, where she could read the rest of Samuel's letter and examine the photographs more carefully. Max followed her toward the front door, but his attention remained fixed on James, and Emily could see the tension in every line of the dog's body. When they reached the entryway, she heard James moving around in the study, and she realized that he had no intention of leaving the house when she did. Whatever he was searching for, he intended to find it today. As Emily stepped out into the gray afternoon, she saw that Richard's truck was parked down the street, as if he were watching to see what would happen between her and James. The whole situation was beginning to feel like a trap, with herself as the primary target. She needed to find somewhere safe to figure out what Samuel had really been involved in, and what these men were so determined to find. Max pressed against her leg as they walked toward her car, and Emily realized that the dog was not just offering comfort, but also guidance. Samuel had trained Max well, and the animal clearly understood more about this situation than any dog should. As they drove away from the house, Emily caught sight of James in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway and watching their departure, with an expression that looked more calculating than disappointed. Emily found refuge in the one place in Millbrook where she had always felt safe, the small apartment above Murphy's Diner that she had been renting since starting her business. Classes at the community college. The familiar sounds of the evening dinner rushed downstairs provided a comforting backdrop as she spread Samuel's letters and photographs across her kitchen table, Max lying alertly beside her chair as if standing guard against any unwelcome visitors. The correspondence painted a picture of her uncle that was both fascinating and troubling. Samuel had been involved in what appeared to be an international network of scholars, museum curators, and legal experts who worked together to trace the ownership history of cultural artifacts that had been displaced during various conflicts and economic upheavals throughout the 20th century. The letters revealed a man who had dedicated the later years of his life to righting historical wrongs, often at considerable personal expense and risk. One letter from a curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York caught Emily's attention. It described a collection of medieval manuscripts that had been looted from a monastery in Eastern Europe during World War II and had recently surfaced in private collections throughout the United States. Samuel had apparently been working to verify the authenticity of these manuscripts and coordinate their return to their country of origin, despite significant pressure from collectors who had paid substantial sums for what they believed were legitimate acquisitions. The photographs were even more revealing. Emily recognized several items that she had seen in Samuel's house, pieces that she had always assumed were simply interesting souvenirs from his travels. Now she understood that these objects were actually priceless artifacts that were being held in trust while their proper ownership was established. A small bronze figurine that had always sat on Samuel's mantelpiece was identified in one of the photos as a Roman artifact worth over $50,000, with documentation showing that it had been stolen from an Italian museum in the 1970s. The scope of Samuel's work was staggering, and Emily began to understand why James Whitmore had been so insistent about authentication services. If James had acquired artifacts through questionable channels, Samuel's reputation and expertise would have been invaluable in legitimizing those purchases. But Samuel's letter had made it clear that he had become suspicious of James's true motives and had been stalling their business relationship while conducting his own investigation. A knock at her door interrupted Emily's research, and she quickly gathered the papers before checking the peephole. To her surprise, she saw Mrs. Henderson, Samuel's elderly sister, standing in the hallway with what appeared to be an official-looking envelope in her hands. Emily opened the door, noting that Mrs. Henderson looked distressed and uncertain. "Emily, dear," the older woman said, "I'm so sorry to bother you this evening, but something very strange has happened. Mr. Pearson at the law office asked me to deliver this to you personally. It seems Samuel's will has been found, but there are some unusual circumstances surrounding it." Emily accepted the envelope with growing apprehension. She had assumed that Samuel's will would be a straightforward document, probably leaving his modest estate to be divided among his surviving relatives. But Mrs. Henderson's expression suggested that the reality was far more complicated. "What kind of unusual circumstances?" Emily asked, inviting Mrs. Henderson to sit down while trying to keep the research materials out of sight. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said carefully, "it appears that Samuel prepared two different wills. The first one was filed with Mr. Pearson years ago and leaves everything to be divided among the family. But this second one was found just yesterday in Samuel's safe deposit box, and it's dated much more recently. The strange thing is that your name appears prominently in the new version. Emily felt her stomach drop as she opened the envelope and scanned the legal document inside. According to this will, Samuel had left her not only a substantial sum of money, but also specific items from his collection, including several pieces that were described in terms that matched the artifacts she had just been reading about. The implications were staggering, both financially and legally. "Mrs. Henderson," Emily said slowly, "I had no idea about any of this. Uncle Samuel never mentioned changing his will or leaving me anything significant." The older woman's expression was kind but troubled. "I believe you, dear. Samuel always spoke very highly of you, and he appreciated your interest in his work. But you should know that Richard is already talking to people about this, and some of his ideas about the situation are quite uncharitable." As if summoned by their conversation, Emily heard footsteps on the stairs leading to her apartment, followed by Richard's voice, calling her name in a tone that suggested he was not bringing good news. She opened the door to find her distant cousin accompanied by two men she didn't recognize, both wearing expressions that seemed professionally skeptical. "Emily Patterson," one of the men said, producing a badge that identified him as an investigator with the County Fraud Prevention Office. "We'd like to ask you some questions about your relationship with Samuel Henderson and the circumstances surrounding his recent will." Emily felt the world shifting around her as she realized that Richard had followed through on his threats to involve law enforcement. The presence of fraud investigators suggested that serious accusations had been made, accusations that could have devastating consequences for her reputation and her future. "I don't understand," Emily said, though she was beginning to understand all too well. "What exactly are you investigating?" Richard stepped forward with an expression of false concern that didn't mask his satisfaction. "Emily, I know this is difficult, but we have to consider the possibility that Samuel wasn't thinking clearly in his final months. The new will appeared under very questionable circumstances, and there are questions about whether certain people might have taken advantage of his condition." The investigator consulted his notes before continuing. "We've received reports that you had unusual access to Mr. Henderson's home, and that valuable items may have been removed from the property without proper documentation. We've also been told that you were present when certain suspicious events occurred, including the appearance of an expensive artifact at the funeral service." Emily's mind raced as she tried to process the multiple accusations that were being leveled against her. Someone had twisted the story of Max's arrival at the funeral into evidence of theft, and her close relationship with Samuel was being reframed as elder abuse. The new will, which should have been seen as evidence of her uncle's affection and trust, was instead being portrayed as proof of manipulation. "These accusations are completely false," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that was building in her chest. "Uncle Samuel was mentally sharp right up until he passed away, and I never took anything from his house without his permission." "Then you won't mind if we conduct a search of your apartment," the second investigator said. "If you have nothing to hide, this should clear up any misunderstandings quickly." Emily realized that she was trapped in an impossible situation. The research materials scattered across her kitchen table would only support Richard's accusations, even though she had discovered them legitimately using the key that Max had delivered. The photographs and letters that proved Samuel's involvement in international artifact recovery would be seen as evidence that she had been helping him hide valuable items from his estate. Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening to this exchange, with growing dismay finally spoke up. "Gentlemen, I think you're making a serious mistake. Emily has always been devoted to Samuel, and the idea that she would take advantage of him is simply ridiculous." "Mrs. Henderson," Richard said with practiced patience, "I know this is hard to accept, but we have to face facts. Emily spent more time at Samuel's house than anyone else in the family. She had access to his personal belongings, And now we discover that she's named as a major beneficiary in a will that appeared under mysterious circumstances. As the investigators began to examine her apartment, Emily felt a crushing sense of helplessness. Everything that had seemed like a fascinating mystery just hours before was now being used as evidence against her character and integrity. The key that Max had brought to the funeral, the hidden compartment in Samuel's desk, the letters that revealed her uncle's important work, all of it was being twisted into a narrative that painted her as a manipulative thief. Max sensed her distress and pressed closer to her side, his warm presence providing the only comfort available in a situation that was spiraling rapidly out of control. Emily realized that she was facing not just legal consequences, but the complete destruction of her reputation in the small community where she had grown up. The investigators were already photographing the research materials, and she could see Richard's satisfaction as he watched his accusations being taken seriously by official authorities. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, Emily felt something else beginning to grow inside her. It was a determination that reminded her of Samuel's own steadfast commitment to truth and justice, even when facing powerful opposition. Her uncle had spent years fighting to return stolen artifacts to their rightful owners, often against wealthy collectors and unscrupulous dealers who had everything to gain from maintaining the status quo. If Samuel had trusted her with the key to his hidden research, if he had named her in his will, despite knowing the controversy it would cause, then he must have believed that she was strong enough to carry on his work. The accusations being made against her were not just attacks on her character. They were attempts to stop the investigation that Samuel had started, investigations that apparently threatened people with significant resources and influence. As the investigators continued their search, Emily began to understand that the real crime was not anything she had done, but rather the systematic effort to discredit her before she could learn the full truth about Samuel's work and the powerful interests that opposed it. The battle for her uncle's legacy was just beginning, and she was determined to prove herself worthy of the trust he had placed in her. The Millbrook Community Center had never felt so hostile to Emily as it did on the evening of the monthly. At town council meeting, word of the fraud investigation had spread through the small town with the speed that only gossip could achieve, and Emily could feel the weight of suspicious stares as she entered the building. She had come tonight because her lawyer had advised her that avoiding public appearances would only make her look more guilty, but every instinct told her that walking into this room was a mistake. The meeting was supposed to be about routine, municipal business, but Emily quickly realized that Richard had orchestrated something far more damaging. As the council members took their seats, she noticed that several people she didn't recognize were seated in the front rows, including the fraud investigators who had searched her apartment 3 days earlier. The setup felt like an ambush, and Emily understood that she was about to face a very public trial in the court of community opinion. Mayor Davidson called the meeting to order with his usual pompous formality, but his expression was troubled as he glanced in Emily's direction. She had known the mayor since childhood, and his family had always been friendly with Samuel's. The fact that he seemed uncomfortable suggested that he had been pressured into allowing this spectacle to proceed against his better judgment. Before we begin tonight's regular business, Mayor Davidson announced, "We need to address some serious concerns that have been raised about the recent events surrounding the estate of Samuel Henderson. Mr. Richard Caldwell has requested permission to present information that may be relevant to ongoing investigations." Emily felt her cheeks burn as every head in the room turned toward her. She had anticipated that Richard might try to use a public forum to spread his accusations, but she hadn't expected him to be given official sanction to do so. The presence of the investigators and several other unfamiliar faces suggested that this was more than just a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. Richard stood up with the satisfaction of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. He had dressed formally for the occasion, and his bearing suggested that he viewed himself as a crusader for justice rather than a bitter relative pursuing a personal vendetta. In his hands was a folder that Emily suspected contained carefully selected evidence designed to support his narrative. "Citizens of Millbrook," Richard began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to addressing crowds, "we are facing a situation that threatens the integrity of our community and the safety of our most vulnerable residents. The recent events surrounding my cousin Samuel's estate have revealed a pattern of manipulation and possible criminal behavior that we cannot ignore." Emily felt the room's attention shift toward her like a physical force, and she struggled to maintain her composure as Richard continued his prepared presentation. He spoke about elder abuse with the passion of someone who genuinely cared about protecting the elderly, but Emily could see the calculation behind his words. Every accusation was carefully crafted to sound reasonable and concerning, without making specific claims that could be easily disproven. Samuel Henderson was a trusting man who welcomed people into his home and shared his interests with anyone, who showed genuine appreciation for his work, Richard continued. Unfortunately, that trust may have been exploited by someone who saw opportunity in an elderly man's generosity and isolation. The investigator who had searched Emily's apartment stood up when Richard gestured toward him. "We have discovered evidence that valuable artifacts were removed from Mr. Henderson's residence without proper documentation. We have also found that a will favorable to certain individuals appeared under questionable circumstances shortly after Mr. Henderson's passing." Emily realized that she was listening to a carefully orchestrated presentation designed to destroy her reputation without giving her any opportunity to defend herself. The format of a town council meeting meant that she couldn't interrupt or challenge the accusations being made, and the presence of official investigators lent credibility to claims that were based on speculation and misrepresentation. Furthermore, the investigator continued, "We have reason to believe that this situation may be part of a larger pattern involving the illegal trafficking of cultural artifacts. Mr. Henderson's collection included items that may have been stolen from museums and cultural institutions, and we are investigating whether certain individuals may have been helping to conceal the true ownership of these objects." The accusation hit Emily like a physical blow. Not only was she being accused of elder abuse and theft, but now she was being linked to international art trafficking. The scope of the accusations was so broad and serious that even people who had known her since childhood would have difficulty dismissing them entirely. Mayor Davidson looked uncomfortable as he tried to maintain control of the meeting. "Mr. Caldwell, these are very serious allegations. Are you saying that criminal charges are being considered?" "The investigation is ongoing," Richard replied smoothly. "But I think our community has a right to know when someone in our midst may be taking advantage of our trust and putting our most vulnerable citizens at risk." Emily could no longer remain silent. She stood up, her voice shaking with anger and frustration. "These accusations are completely false, and everyone in this room who knows me should understand that I would never hurt Uncle Samuel or take advantage of anyone." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Emily could see that some people were nodding in agreement while others looked skeptical. Richard had chosen his timing perfectly, catching her when she was already under investigation and making it appear that her defense was simply the desperate protests of someone who had been caught. "Miss Patterson," Richard said with false sympathy, "I understand that this is difficult for you, but we have to look at the evidence objectively. Your close relationship with Samuel, combined with the suspicious circumstances surrounding his will and the appearance of valuable artifacts at his funeral, creates a pattern that cannot be ignored. Emily felt tears of frustration building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of the crowd that was watching her every reaction. She had come to this meeting hoping to maintain some dignity, but she was being systematically humiliated by people who had twisted her love for her uncle into evidence of criminal behavior. That's when James Whitmore entered the community center. Emily hadn't seen him since the day at Samuel's house, and his presence at the town council meeting was unexpected enough to cause a stir among the assembled crowd. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but there was something different about his demeanor. The careful neutrality that had characterized his previous interactions was gone, replaced by what appeared to be controlled anger. "Mayor Davidson," James said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I believe there are some serious misrepresentations being made here tonight, and I think this community deserves to hear the complete truth before reaching any conclusions about Miss Patterson's character." Richard's confident expression faltered slightly as he realized that an unexpected variable had entered his carefully planned presentation. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. We're dealing with potential criminal activity, not business disputes." "On the contrary," James replied, moving toward the front of the room with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I understand the situation better than anyone here. I've been working with Samuel Henderson for over 2 years, and I can tell you that Miss Patterson's integrity has never been in question." Emily felt a wave of surprise and confusion. James's defense of her character was the last thing she had expected, especially given Samuel's warnings about his true motives. But as she watched him face down Richard and the investigators, she began to wonder if her uncle's assessment might have been incomplete, or if the situation was more complex than either of them had understood. "Mr. Henderson was involved in extremely important work," James continued, "work that involved tracking down stolen cultural artifacts and returning them to their rightful owners. Miss Patterson wasn't taking advantage of an elderly man. She was being trained to continue work that has international significance." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as this new information sank in. Richard looked stunned, clearly unprepared, for a defense that reframed Samuel's activities and Emily's involvement in an entirely different light. Even the investigators seemed caught off guard by James's confident assertions about the nature of Samuel's work. "That's a very convenient story," Richard said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "But where's the proof? If Samuel was involved in such important work, why was it kept secret? Why are there no official records of these activities?" James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder that appeared to contain official documents. "Because the work often involves cooperation with law enforcement agencies and international organizations that require discretion. Samuel Henderson was a consultant for the FBI's art crime team, and his collection included items that were being held as evidence in ongoing investigations." Emily felt her world shift as James's words sank in. If what he was saying was true, then Samuel's mysterious activities and his warnings about powerful enemies made perfect sense. Her uncle hadn't just been a private collector working with museums. He had been involved in official efforts to combat international art theft and trafficking. The investigator who had been supporting Richard's accusations suddenly looked uncertain. If Samuel had been working with federal law enforcement, then the local fraud investigation could be interfering with ongoing federal cases. The implications were serious enough to make even the most skeptical observer reconsider the accusations that had been made against Emily. "Furthermore," James continued, The accusations being made against Miss Patterson are not only false, but potentially dangerous. The people involved in international art trafficking are not small-time criminals, and anyone who threatens to expose their operations faces serious risks. Emily realized that James was suggesting that the attacks on her reputation were not just the result of Richard's personal grievances, but part of a larger effort to discredit Samuel's work and prevent the completion of his investigations. The idea that she had become a target because of her uncle's activities was terrifying, but it also explained the systematic nature of the campaign against her. As the meeting dissolved into confused discussions and heated arguments, Emily found herself looking at James with new eyes. His intervention had been unexpected and effective, but it also raised new questions about his true role in Samuel's work and his reasons for defending her so publicly. The man her uncle had warned her about had just saved her from complete social destruction, and Emily wasn't sure what that meant for her understanding of the complex situation she had inherited. 2 days after the explosive town council meeting, Emily found herself back in Samuel's study, but this time she was not alone. James sat across from her at the antique desk, and between them lay a collection of documents that painted a picture more complex and remarkable than either of them had initially understood. Max rested peacefully beside Emily's chair, his earlier suspicion of James apparently resolved by recent revelations. "I owe you an explanation," James said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that Emily had never heard before. "Your uncle's letter about me was partially correct, but the situation was more complicated than either of you realized at the time." Emily studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his usually confident posture seemed less certain. The man who had commanded the town council meeting with such authority now appeared almost nervous, as if he were about to reveal something that could change everything between them. "I did approach Samuel about authentication services," James continued, "but not for the reasons he suspected. I inherited a collection from my grandfather, a collection that included items he had acquired during his service in World War II. When I began researching the pieces, I discovered that many of them had been looted from museums and private collections in Europe." Emily felt a shift in her understanding as James's words sank in. If his grandfather had been a soldier who had appropriated artifacts during the war, then James's attempts to authenticate them weren't about legitimizing stolen goods for profit. They were about determining how to return items that had been wrongfully taken. "Samuel was initially suspicious of my motives," James admitted. "A wealthy businessman asking for authentication services on potentially looted artifacts looks exactly like someone trying to clean dirty money through legitimate channels. But over time, I managed to convince him that my intentions were honorable." James reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder that contained correspondence between himself and various museums and cultural institutions around the world. The letters detailed efforts to trace ownership histories and coordinate the return of artifacts to their countries of origin, work that had been conducted in partnership with Samuel's expertise and connections. "Your uncle and I had been working together for over a year," James explained. "He was helping me navigate the complex legal and ethical issues involved in returning wartime artifacts, and I was providing funding for his research into other cases of cultural trafficking. The business relationship that seemed suspicious to you was actually a partnership dedicated to righting historical wrongs." Emily thought about Samuel's warning letter and realized that her uncle's concerns had been reasonable given the limited information he had possessed at the time. James's initial approach would have seemed suspicious to anyone who had spent years dealing with unscrupulous collectors and dealers. But the evidence before her now suggested that Samuel had eventually come to trust James and had been working with him toward shared goals. "Then why was Uncle Samuel still worried about you when he wrote that letter?" Emily asked. "He seemed genuinely concerned that you might be dangerous." James's expression darkened, and he pulled out another set of documents that appeared to be bank records and legal correspondence. "Because someone had been pressuring both of us to stop our work. Samuel had received threatening letters, and there had been attempts to break into his house. He was beginning to suspect that our investigations had attracted the attention of people who had significant financial interests in maintaining the status quo." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place as Emily realized that the real threat had not been James, but rather the people who opposed the work that he and Samuel had been doing together. International art trafficking was a multi-billion-dollar industry, and their efforts to return stolen artifacts would have threatened the profits of collectors, dealers, and auction houses around the world. "Richard," Emily said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "He wasn't just jealous about the will, he was working for someone else." James nodded grimly. Richard had been feeding information about Samuel's activities to a network of dealers who specialized in artifacts with questionable provenance. The campaign to discredit you wasn't just about family money, it was about stopping the completion of investigations that could expose decades of systematic fraud. Emily felt anger building in her chest as she thought about how Richard had manipulated her grief and her community's trust to serve the interests of criminals. His accusations about elder abuse and theft had been projection, covering his own exploitation of Samuel's trust and his attempts to undermine work that threatened his criminal associates. "We have evidence," James continued, producing recordings and photographs that documented Richard's meetings with known art dealers and his attempts to remove items from Samuel's collection before they could be properly catalogued. "The FBI has been monitoring the situation and they're ready to make arrests as soon as we can provide testimony about Samuel's work and the attempts to intimidate both of you." As Emily processed this information, she realized that her uncle's trust in her had been even more significant than she had understood. By giving her the key to his hidden research, Samuel had been ensuring that his work would continue, even if something happened to him. The responsibility was daunting, but Emily felt a growing sense of purpose as she understood the importance of what Samuel had been trying to accomplish. "There's something else," James said softly, his professional composure finally giving way to something more personal. "Working with Samuel taught me more than just how to research artifact provenance. He helped me understand the difference between collecting objects for personal satisfaction and preserving cultural heritage for future generations. He also helped me realize that the most valuable discoveries are often the relationships we build along the way." Emily looked into his eyes and saw not the calculating businessman she had initially distrusted, but someone who had been genuinely changed by his work with her uncle. The careful distance he had maintained had been protection, not coldness, and his intervention at the town council meeting had required him to reveal information that could have jeopardized ongoing investigations. "What happens now?" Emily asked, though she was beginning to understand that the answer would involve choices that would change the direction of her entire life. "Now we finish what Samuel started," James replied. "The research he was conducting involves dozens of cases of stolen artifacts, and there are museums and communities around the world waiting for those items to come home. It's challenging work, sometimes dangerous, but it's also the most meaningful thing I've ever been involved in." Emily thought about her uncle's letter and his belief that she had the gift of observation necessary to continue his work. The past weeks had tested her in ways she had never imagined, forcing her to grow from a naive young woman into someone capable of facing powerful opposition and standing up for principles that mattered more than personal comfort. "I want to help, Emily," said, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. "Uncle Samuel trusted me with this responsibility, and I won't let his work be destroyed by people who care more about profit than justice." James smiled, and Emily saw genuine warmth in his expression for the first time since they had met. "Samuel would be proud of you. He always said that you had the intelligence and integrity to carry on his legacy, but I think even he would be impressed by how strong you've become." As they began planning their next steps, Emily realized that the frightened young woman who had sat in the funeral parlor just weeks ago had been transformed by the challenges she had faced. The accusations and investigations that had seemed so threatening at the time had actually been opportunities for her to discover her own strength and to understand the importance of fighting for something larger than herself. Max rose from his position beside Emily's chair and moved to where James sat, settling down with a contented sigh that seemed to indicate his approval of the partnership that was forming. The dog's acceptance was somehow the final piece Emily needed to feel confident about the path she was choosing. Over the following months, as they worked together to complete Samuel's investigations and coordinate the return of stolen artifacts to their rightful homes, Emily and James discovered that their shared commitment to justice had grown into something deeper and more personal. The trust that had been built through facing danger together had become the foundation for a relationship that neither of them had expected, but both had come to treasure. The work was exactly as challenging as James had warned, involving complex international negotiations, careful research, and occasional confrontations with people who would stop at nothing to protect their illegal profits. But Emily found that she had inherited not just Samuel's research skills, but also his determination to see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. Richard and his associates were eventually arrested and prosecuted, their network of art trafficking exposed by the evidence that Samuel had carefully gathered over years of patient investigation. The vindication was satisfying, but Emily discovered that the real reward was in the letters she received from museums and communities around the world, thanking her for helping to bring home pieces of their cultural heritage that had been lost for decades. As she stood in the study that had become the headquarters for their growing organization, Emily realized that the mysterious key Max had brought to the funeral had opened more than just a hidden compartment. It had unlocked a life of purpose and meaning that she could never have imagined, and had brought her together with someone who shared her commitment to making the world a more just and beautiful place. The work they were doing together was more than just a career. It was a calling that honored Samuel's memory while building something new and hopeful for the future. And as James took her hand while they planned their next expedition to return artifacts to a small museum in Eastern Europe, Emily knew that the love they had found was built on the strongest possible foundation: shared values, mutual respect, and a commitment to something greater than themselves. Dear listeners, we hope that Emily and James's story has touched your hearts and shown you the power of standing up for what's right, even when it seems impossible. Like the precious artifacts they worked to return home, sometimes the most valuable things in life are discovered when we have the courage to look beyond the surface and fight for truth. If this story has inspired you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales of love, courage, and the triumph of justice over greed. Every day, we bring you stories that celebrate the complexity and beauty of human relationships, and your support helps us continue sharing these meaningful narratives. Hit that like button if Emily's journey resonated with you, and tell us in the comments what values you would be willing to fight for in your own life.